It's extra drama for book number 27, Love Struck. I am your host, Marissa Flaxbart, and with me again is Molly McKellar. Hello.
Hello.
That sounded very radio-like, right? I'm getting the rhythm of this down.
You got it. It's golden.
We were mentioned in our main episode last week, something called a poetry night, poetry reading night.
Yeah, it was something organized by Suzanne at the school.
And I would say, there's no way for you to have known this, but that the poetry reading was introduced in the previous book actually as a way to quickly and succinctly describe the sort of snob that Suzanne Hanlon was.
Okay.
Which makes me a little sad as someone who likes and in fact loves poetry. And Elizabeth's reaction to getting a phone call from Suzanne inviting her to read a piece at this poetry night, is that she thinks the whole thing is a little bit too highbrow for Sweet Valley High.
I was a little shocked that they were having a poetry reading at a high school.
Well, is it at the high school or is it like in their living room or something?
But I felt like she was reaching out to kids from their
Definitely.
school.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So I couldn't quite tell from me just reading it as like this random thing. I didn't know where it was set up or not. That I thought it was an event that she organized through school. And that's just because the people who read were her classmates.
It definitely, if it were just at her house, like, how would everybody have gotten there? There's this funny line, though, even now that the poetry reading is actually happening, where Elizabeth observes that there's a pretty good turnout.
Yeah.
And she wondered if maybe she was wrong about the town of Sweet Valley, or if it was just that it was Wednesday night and there's nothing else to do.
I had to laugh about that.
Yeah.
I also love that didn't she describe them sitting in like a semicircle so you could see everybody?
The whole thing sounds like, the literary evening, which is another thing they call it.
Oh, Lord.
A literary evening does sound a little highbrow for Sweet Valley High or any high school.
Yeah.
It was being held in a small wood-paneled room off the library at the high school. So you're totally right. For some reason this time through, I was picturing it in this bizarre room that gets described in the book. It's a room in the Hanlon house that Ken gets escorted into.
Oh, yeah, with the paintings.
Yeah, where everything is white except for the abstract paintings brightly colored on the wall, and it just feels so 80s to me. Recently, I wish I could remember what account it was, but somebody on, it might have been like Neon Talk on Instagram, posted a bunch of IKEA catalogs from like the different years in the 80s, and wow.
And I bet that was...
Some of them were amazing, and some of them were, like, so, like, ugly in a way where it's hard for you to wrap your mind around this ever-seeming fashionable.
Yep.
Like, kind of weird sort of calico printed couches and in, like, a brown room.
Brown carpet, brown this, brown that, yeah.
Yeah, but this was a white room with abstract paintings on the wall. But that's not where it was held.
Yeah, it was held at the school, and it seemed as if the people there were kind of the people who were more like Suzanne and less like Elizabeth.
Yes, but another thing that I do love about this, because I don't think there's anything wrong with having a poetry reading in high school.
Not at all.
I think it's a fun idea, and there's part of me that bristled a little bit, I guess, as I referenced before, at the idea that this alone would somehow reveal Suzanne to be some kind of terrible snob. But I think what reveals her personality more than anything is that the quality of these poems seems very poor. But Suzanne is, like, so far up her own ass that she's just like, oh, it's so beautiful. Oh, everything is amazing. Like, the art, you know.
In particular, there was one young woman who read a horrible piece.
And much to my delight, like, we didn't get to hear about the dead squirrel.
Which is a shame.
We didn't get to hear Elizabeth's poem or Winston Egbert, who read a series of amazingly funny short poems.
Yeah.
That reminds me, actually, that the one time I did stand-up that I was paid for, I was paid like $7 and a free beer.
Hey.
Part of my act consisted of me reading mean haikus, I think is what I called them. And I should have seen if I could find any of those to share with you, but I don't think they were really that funny. It was a noble effort. I used to host an open mic in Chicago. I hosted the Chicago Ladies in Comedy, was a organization that I helped found, actually, in Chicago. And so for a few years, when we were all kind of in Chicago still and sort of moved away and the organization became its own thing. But for a while, we were doing these open mics, and I would host them, which was fun.
Yeah.
And it was very fun. I mean, it was like really cool to get to host a comedy open mic. And I didn't have to do the stand-up thing of always saying the same jokes. Like, in fact, I couldn't. Like, it wouldn't have made sense for me at every night to like do the same material. And also the pressure to actually be funny was very low as the host of an open mic. So because of that, some dear soul got the idea that I was a stand-up comic and that I could be a part of their comedy showcase. You know what? I'm really being self-deprecating. It went fine.
I was going to say, I'm sure it went just fine. You're a very funny person.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So,
hopefully listeners agree.
I do want to listen to some mean haikus. You should do some haikus of Sweet Valley High is what you should be doing.
Oh, that's a good idea. I remember that one of them, I think, was about Kendra, who was a reality TV star at the time. This is a long time ago.
I was like, I don't even know who this is.
Okay, so all of that was a tangent because blissfully we do get to hear most of one poem in particular.
Yes.
And this was something that really stood out to me first read through a number of years ago. If you want to read what I thought then, sweetvalleydiaries.net is the website. It's existed since 2006. And may I read to you this passage?
Please.
Rather than just reading the poem, I think I'm going to put in the context.
Yeah,
because
I think it sets it up.
Yeah. Another senior, Joni Shreves, was reading at the moment. Joni was dressed in black. She was reading a poem about the ghost of a woman named Daphne who had been murdered by her husband. Daphne sighed, Joni read in a passionate voice, as the world, a bright red apple, split at the center, revealing a core that rained appleseed tears on the parched soil of her dreams. Elizabeth smiled as she took her eyes off the girl and let her gaze wander around the room. Ken and Suzanne were sitting together at the opposite end of the semicircle. Ken looked as if he shared Elizabeth's opinion about the poem. His face was a mixture of confusion and boredom. Elizabeth was secretly glad she hadn't caught his eye. She was sure that if they looked at each other, they would burst out laughing. Suzanne, however, hung on every word Joni read. She even gasped and nodded her head several times. Elizabeth worried privately about the two of them, especially Ken. He seemed to be devoted to Suzanne, and she seemed to feel the same way, but it appeared to Elizabeth that Suzanne was always trying to direct him. She seemed to be trying to change a lot of the best parts of Ken. And Elizabeth was afraid that Ken couldn't see it at all. Elizabeth refocused on Joni as the girl finished her poem. A life, her life, the blood, the warmth, like a baby with a bottle, the sun, the sun. The end.
I think I even purposely skipped over the part of the poem that was read. I'm like, this sucks. And I just moved into Elizabeth's inner thoughts.
That must have been fun to write, though. I feel like writing a bad poem would be fun.
It reminds me of a scene in Bob's Burgers, which is a great show, where their Aunt Gail says their poetry. And it is very reminiscent of Joni's passage there.
Yes, I know. I do. I remember what you're talking about. Yeah. Oh gosh. And when I say fun to write, I don't mean fun for Joni. I mean fun for Kate William.
Exactly.
Again, air quotes don't work on a podcast, but yeah. So
it was.
poems.
I did like that at least it showed the good side of poetry, right? Like these clever poems or these little short poems or whatever poem Elizabeth read that was well received.
Yeah.
And then also what gets lumped in with poetry are these horrible things of what people think are poems or what works as a poem.
Have you ever written any poetry?
Yes. It's been a while since I've written it, but yes.
I love poetry, and I like to write it, but I definitely have read enough bad poetry that there's a certain fear, I think, in that, like, well, what if this is emotive in a way that's going to come off as being just silly?
I think what's interesting about poems is you really are trying to articulate an idea in a very short, well, sometimes very short, but sometimes very long way. Like you're trying to be clever with language.
Yeah.
And I think so few people understand that poetry really is about the words that are being used and the patterns that they're being used in. I tend to read good poetry. I can't say I've read some bad poetry, but maybe it's because I'm rather picky and only pick poetry books or collections of poems that have been thoroughly vetted by.
Sure.
But a lot of the poems that I'm drawn to are these kind of visual story poems and less of these very abstract poems of like images or words of whatever Joni was trying to do there. Or
Right. Well, and actually that's Joni's poem, I think, gives a good example of what, because I mean, bad poetry, good poetry, I mean, to a certain extent, it is a little bit like art where you talk about like bad and good, it's subjective. But I think one of the reasons why we can say that this poem feels objectively bad is because she's forcing in these metaphors that don't really make sense and they don't evoke anything other than laughter, like in Elizabeth.
Yeah, it was as if she was just sitting there and she's like, what things are red that are like blood? Mm-hmm. And what things are, you know, can be split in some sort of thing. There, she felt disconnected from her poem.
Sure. That's a good point, because like what things can metaphorically, like the metaphor doesn't even really work. Like like when you think of something being split open, you don't think of an apple being split open. When you think of apple seeds, you don't think of them raining down out of an apple. This is really more analysis of this poem than we need to be doing. But.
Well, it does show to some extent the access that I assume, middle class to upper middle class, even very wealthy teenage girl would have as an understanding of murder and what that images and thoughts and feelings would be related to that, as opposed to someone who maybe had not experience with murder, but knew someone who was murdered, who have violence in the home, violence in their community, might have a better way of expressing that. And I think that sometimes, especially when you're young and even now, you should write what you know, right? Like start where you know. Yeah.
I have been reading more poetry recently because I guess I was just reminded of how much I enjoy it. I actually just finished this morning a book of poems by Mary Oliver, who I've been hearing a lot about recently. She passed away a few months ago.
Remember you telling me about this book?
And I bought it the day I saw you last. It was called Evidence. I got it at the last bookstore in Los Angeles.
Great bookstore.
And it's just the poems. I mean, she writes a lot about nature. And I do think that she uses language cleverly, but I think what's so great about those poems is the way that they evoke an emotion. And I think that you can leave the poem feeling something that you didn't feel when you started.
Yeah.
About not about the poem, but about like the world.
Yeah.
I also read some poetry recently by a poet I had not heard of until a friend of mine mentioned him, named Carl Dennis. And there are more like story poems. Yeah. And I just really was excited about that because rather than, I mean, the poems, they have a certain meter to them that they retain within the poem. But boy, similarly, it's like it makes you feel a certain thing. It's like evoking a specific moment. And the way that like a good story, like Ken's story, let's going back to Ken's story. it was exciting that he was telling this, tell-all reveal of everything that happened. But I think the reason that a story like that, or the reason that people even say tell your own story, is because when you put something forward that has details that are honest and specific, for whatever reason, other human beings see that truth and relate to it, even though it is not their story at all. It's very specifically someone else's story. It's like you see the humanity there, and somehow that evokes something in you.
Yeah,
Which is how I feel about these poems, these Carl Dennis poems.
I mean, good poetry does that. It gives you an image or an insight, or the way that it flows, or the sound of it. That's why I always like to read poetry aloud, actually.
You should have a literary evening.
Exactly, I should.
Maybe we should have a literary evening. We're not in high school, so...
Wine will always be involved. And you bring your favorite poem that you have read lately. I have not read much poetry as of late.
Oh, I know this great poem by this fictional teenager named Joni.
Oh, really?
But what does the middle sound like? I genuinely was not expecting to have a serious conversation about poetry in this bonus episode. I thought we were just going to make fun of Joni. But
we can make fun of Joni.
No, making fun of Joni is over. I am thrilled that we talked seriously about poetry.
Lovely.
Molly, thanks again for joining me.
You're welcome.
Listeners, tune in next week to find out who Lynn Henry might possibly be.
I'm excited.
Until then, sweetvalleydiaries.net. Go check it out if you haven't seen it. It is a website that I made in 2006. It's actually changed a lot since I made it in 2006, but, it's got stuff.
Lots of good stuff.
Sweet Valley stuff.
You can track Elizabeth and Jessica.
Yeah, track them. You could even read ahead.
Ooh.
Because I have recaps through book 50.
Excellent.
First time through. And the podcast is housed there. All right. Thanks again. Bye.
Today's that made me Miss America?
That's too funny. Yeah, that part was so painful. Why would you talk? And then I'm like, this is what you go with? Okay. But that would be, I guess, fun for the writer.
My favorite part of it is how it shows Suzanne to be total fake.
Yeah.
Like, she's just pretending to be
An intellectual.
I mean, she has these intellectual interests, but I guess it just makes me feel like she's just playing at it, Like, like she wants to seem, that was a very real thing, right? I mean, I'm sure to a certain extent I was like that as a high schooler.
Oh, I think everybody is when they're trying to figure out who they are or what matters to them.
Yeah.
But
I'm trying to think of... I would never have been cruel to people, I hope, about my pretensions, but I think about it a lot now with music. Like, I did not listen to a ton of, like, pop music, unless it was, like, ironically. I don't know if you were like... But I definitely... A lot of the, like, hipster stuff that gets talked about now, when I think back on myself in, like, middle and high school, I was like, I was really doing everything ironically all the time. I used to blast New Kids on the Block in my minivan.